Hey everyone, thank you for joining us again this week for another Vox Out of Office stream. We are here talking about the Cambridge 50, and more specifically, we are talking about using the Brit amp models, the three that are in the Cambridge 50 that kind of cover that crunch British classic hard rock kind of tone range. There's the Brit 59, the Brit 800, and the Brit VM. And we will get into some of the differences between them, why you would use one versus the other, as well as talk some tones. If you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to leave them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on that on my second screen over here, so I will answer any questions that come up. If I can help clarify something that we're talking about or anything like that, please let me know. If not, we'll just talk some classic riffs and some great tones using these amp models. You can see up in this little box right here, I have Tone Room up and running just so you can see my settings. I'm controlling the amp from the face controls. This will give you an idea of how the amp is set, as well as what each amp model is. And also you'll notice the middle control on the Tone Room screen. That is not something that's on the face of the amp, but if I switch between amp models, it will change because that is sort of preset into each amp mode, and you can change it yourself and save to presets using Tone Room if you like. Tone Room, as this picture-in-picture thing, lags behind a little bit. So if I change a setting and it doesn't move, it will in a couple seconds. There's also the possibility, last time we did this on a Cambridge stream, it cut out after like 15 or 20 minutes. So hopefully we don't lose it. If we do, I'll keep talking to you about how the settings are. So you are hearing me. I'm playing my built Relevator into the Cambridge 50 directly. This is going into my computer over USB, and that is the audio you're hearing from the amp. So this is the same audio you would get if you record yourself using this USB audio interface that's built into the Cambridge, as well as the headphone output. It has the same cabinet emulation built in, so it's great for practicing at home quietly or anything like that. So let's get into it. I wanted to talk starting with like some classic, what I think of when I think this British crunch tone kind of riffs. The absolute first thing that came to mind, I'm actually going to turn the gain up a bit, and let's see if Tone Room shows that in a couple seconds. But the first riff that comes to mind, or the first artist that comes to mind, is Black Sabbath. So here is a riff from Master of Reality. This song is Sweet Leaf. I think it's one of the coolest Black Sabbath riffs that has this kind of thick crunch. This is just what I picture when I'm picturing these modes. So that is kind of the big crunch tone that I picture. This, it looks like Tone Room is lagging behind and not showing. So I'm going to close that window for a second while I talk and see if I can just sort of force it to connect again. But basically, when I think of these amps, this kind of British crunch, that is what I'm thinking of. And I have the gain set fairly high. I have the gain up at about 3 o'clock, so pushed pretty high. to give you this big crunch. And the other big part of that is these. A lot of the riffs that I chose that I'll play later throughout the stream have this power chord configuration that is. So if you can, I'll try to make this really clear. If you can see, I'm barring the 5th fret on the E and A string, and on the D string, I'm playing the 7th fret. This has the 5th note in the bass, which gives it this really thick, as opposed to playing that same power chord. So that adds to this type of riff, and you'll notice that more throughout the stream. Unfortunately, it looks like Tone Room just does not play well with this streaming software, so I will work out that kink for the next time. It always seems to stop right when we hit go live, unfortunately. So I'm going to just tell you the settings I'm using, and that has worked well for us before. So let's stick with that. If I lower that gain again, let's go down pretty low, down to like, maybe this is around 10 o'clock. And I have the bass set around 10 o'clock as well. And the treble is up at 1 o'clock. And this is, if you think like really the like classic rock tone of some of these British bands, some of these bands that were going for more of a crunch sound, but from what I notice, usually on the live recording, it's more crunch because they turn the amp up more. On the studio recording, it's a little cleaner because you have the amp breaking up less with no master volume on an amp or something like that. So if I played something like My Generation, it's still this crunch. You get that crunch in how the amp is slightly breaking up, but it's not that big, thick Black Sabbath riff. And so this is all on the Brit 59 amp model. We haven't changed the amp model, and that keys into one of the biggest things I like about the Cambridge is that the amp models are not stuck in this gain range. There's a big variability to them. Like the AC30 and AC30 top boost amp models, you can really push, or you can get those nice chimey clean tones from. The Brit amp models, you can go down to this like edge of breakup, dirty clean type tone, but also turn it all the way up and get that thick classic crunch and saturation. So if I inch that gain up just a little bit, let's go to about 11. And I'm going to turn the bass up a tiny bit as well to about 11. And you can get a little bit more of a classic rock with a push kind of tone. So if I play something like White Room by Cream. That is, when I think of this amp model, that is the tone, this sort of classic crunch, but it's just like, big, like, what you picture when you just turn up an amp real loud. When I was picking, like, how do I want to show off these amp modes, I kept thinking of the band from Almost Famous. Obviously not a real band, but they had this, the look and the attitude about them because they're capturing that era. And that's sort of what I think with this amp model, just that look and attitude and sound in this case, of just, classic rock. And like I played on the intro before I got into things, we of course have, AC/DC in this. We could do. Oop. So, just that big in your face crunch. Now, if I shift over to the Brit 800 amp model, same settings otherwise. So gain at about 11, bass at about 11, treble at about 1. There's I wish I had tone room to show you this, but there's a small shift in the mid-range. That's the biggest thing you're going to notice. There's a difference in the character of the breakup as well, but the big thing is in that mid-range shift. And in tone room, when you switch between them, 59 has mid all the way maxed. When you go to the 800, it turns the mid down to about 2 or 3 o'clock. So most of the way up, but not all the way. And then when you go to Brit VM, it has it set to about 11. So just like a tiny bit, like completely flat or cutting a little bit of mid-range. And you have the same crunch, but it gives you this different, totally different character just in how the mid-range is shaped. So, back to this AC/DC riff. Now we're on the Brit 800 amp model, and it sounds like this. Once again, going back to 1959 with the same settings. So you hear there's a little bit more, there's a shift in where that mid-range sits. There's a shift in how much mid-range you're hearing, and a little shift in how the crunch forms over that EQ spectrum. They're very similar, but I really like that there's the option to choose what you prefer. Just for reference, I would not pick this for playing this riff, but here is the Brit VM. That's a little bit more big stadium, 80s, 90s, 2000s than this 59 or the 800, which has a little bit more of that classic punch to it, which is that mid-range, really pushing through. So, of course, we can push, if I get that gain back up to about 3 o'clock, and I turn the treble down, so now bass and treble are both at about 11, we could push this to get sort of this faux fuzz tone, and, try some Hendrix. So, of course, that's not, perfectly matching Hendrix's tone. He is famous for using a fuzz pedal into a British amp like this. But turning that gain up and rolling off a little bit of the high end will help you with some of that fuzziness. and getting some of that into the shape of your tone. So if you're using just this amp, whether you have a fuzz pedal or and it's kept at your practice space, so you're not using it at home with this, or you don't have any pedals and you want to just use the amp, this is a great way to get to that range of tone. Not fully there, but you're kind of approximating it, which is great. And actually I had knocked my pickup selector to just a bridge. So let's actually do this on just the neck pickup for a lot darker. So there you go. That is sort of a fuzz on top of this crunch type of sound, using just what the Cambridge has to offer in EQ controls, as well as selecting gain from these different amp models. From here we could kind of we get into this territory of where the 1959 might excel at some things and the 800 at some things, but it's kind of like a Venn diagram, and we're in this center section and not on those two sides. And then I see the VM, like I said, as a separate thing where it's sort of the more stadium metal or 80s, 90s, 2000s hard rock, where maybe we can cover that much more in depth on a separate thing with some of the higher gain settings as well. But that sort of does its own thing, sort of does this thing, but less crossover in that Venn diagram. So if I play something that's in this middle ground, like I can play, I have it set to 1959, gain at noon, bass, I'll turn that down to about 10, and treble up to noon, and I could play Born to Be Wild. Now I can shift that over to the Brit 800. Don't adjust the settings, so gain at noon, bass at about 10, and treble at noon, and play the same riff. And that gives you this different option on that crunch, just two different flavors. So basically I'm going to play a couple more riffs. We're going to go back and forth with a few small tweaks to the settings, but historically accurate, you might want to go with the 59 amp model. That is more likely something that a band like Steppenwolf would use for that track. But if you want to get the tone that you're looking for, and maybe you're covering a song like that, or you are in a band that is inspired by that type of music, there's no, hard set, this one will work better or that one will work better. There's a lot of shift in what excels at what between these two amp models. I could try very similar riff. Let's do back to 1959, gain down to about 11. Let's turn the bass up to about 1 and the treble to about 11, and we could do something like this. So that's a classic riff by Free. That song is All Right Now. And so, that has this kind of subtle crunch to it. But if we move over to the 800, once again, same settings. So as you can see there, it gets a little bit brighter. We have the treble turned down a little bit, but adding the or shifting over to the 800 gives a little bit of that brightness back because it's adding a tiny bit more breakup to the gain. It's, like I said, just a small shifting character. Um, we can try a couple other. I'll play two more riffs for you to kind of demonstrate this. If you're just joining us, we are talking about the Cambridge 50 and its British amp models, the Brit 1959, 800, and VM. And right now we're comparing, you're hearing the Cambridge through its USB audio output. So this is the same as you would hear if you're recording yourself at home or if you were listening through the headphone output to practice at home. But right now we are going back and forth between the 1959 Brit and the Brit 800 to hear just those differences between the two. There's a lot of overlap. I could play, this is a riff I really love from Deep Purple. The song is Highway Star. Let's shift back to Brit 59. I'll turn the gain up to, gain is up to about 1. Bass is up to about 1, and treble is at noon. Now, if we shift that over, same settings, to the Brit 800. Once again, you can hear some of that extra brightness. It also, the way it tightens up in the low end, I really like for that palm muting. As opposed to the Brit 1959 amp model, it has a bit more of that amp sag to it, which is really nice when you are recreating those classic cranked amp sounds. But when you want to palm mute, it gives you a little bit of that flub, which is nice if you want that really vintage sound, or if you want a lot tighter palm muting, the Brit 800 works really well. Now I could play this song from Neil Young. We're going to keep the settings about the same. I shifted the gain to noon, and I set the bass to 1 and the treble to noon. And so this is Cinnamon Girl from Neil Young. Now shifting over to the Brit 800. That is something that a little bit more accurate to the tone would be the 59. And I prefer the 59 for a setting like that. But the Brit 800 amp model does have this nice way it shapes the chord versus the single notes. So if you listen just to the first half of that riff, you hear kind of a shift in how the chords sound different than the single notes. But on the 59, it's a little bit more uniform. It's a little bit more glued together. So different styles, if you were playing fast punk or something where you want a big shift from chords to a lead sound that jumps out, the Brit 800 amp model works great for that. And just how it works with the different harmonic information in a chord versus a single note. So if you're just joining us, we are talking about the Cambridge 50 and its Brit amp models, the Brit 59, the Brit 800, and the Brit VM. We are looking at some classic hard rock tones and how these amp models can work for you. You're hearing the Cambridge 50 from its USB audio output into my computer. So this would be the same as if you were recording yourself from home or practicing with the headphone output. They share the same cabinet SIM processing. So this is the sound of using the Cambridge 50 for recording or practice, either with the USB or headphone output. So from here, I wanted to move on to getting into a little bit outside the classic. If you've watched the other streams we've done, I like to take the classic tone or classic tone idea and then show how that relates to more modern takes on that genre or genres that were inspired by it. So the first thing and the reason that started this shift when I was planning out the stream is if I go to the Brit 59, I'll set the gain to about 2, bass is about 1, treble is about 1. And we can do this sort of classic rock, garage rock revival from the 2000s. There are a couple riffs we could do with this. There's Wolf Mother. As well as we could do Jet. I really love this first Jet album. I feel like it's very underrated. They nailed that garage rock revival, but with their own spin. So here is a really nice riff from their song, Get What You Need. So there you go. That is a nice sound of the Brit 59, which is a much more vintage amp model being used for something a bit more modern. Now, if I play, going back to the Wolf Mother riff, same settings, going over to the Brit 800. It works really well. I prefer the 59 here, but the interesting thing is if I go over to the Brit VM, it has this really great quality. I think it works well with that riff specifically because there's a little bit of that mid-cut sort of preset into this amp model. You can change that with the Tone Room software if you want to set the mid-range differently and save that to a preset. but I like that it has that tiny cut there, or at least it's flat. To my ear, it's less mid-range than the 800 or 59 settings, which gives you this kind of big sound when you're doing those single note riffs. So that's really nice. That is, I had said previously that the Brit VM is better for kind of this stadium metal or hard rock from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Maybe something like Iron Maiden or Metallica. And I can certainly show those in a more high gain focused live stream in the future. But just for the sake of time, I really had to set some constraints to what I'm showing. So we're sticking to those more classic tones from these Brit amp models for this stream today. But if you have any questions and you want to leave those in the chat, please do, and I'm happy to answer them. If not, we will keep riffing and go on to, from this kind of garage rock revival, we can take a step back to more of a garage punk, or I don't really know how to classify this. If I start with showing on the 59, I'll set the gain to about noon, and I'll leave the bass and treble at about 1 o'clock each. I could do something like The Clash. So you can really get those, birth of punk, classic tones. The 59 does that really well. You could certainly do that with the Brit 800. For that, I'm going to turn the treble down to about 11 o'clock. Oh, I turned the bass down. Give me 1 second. So that is something I think works better with the 59 amp model, but staying on the 800, I'm going to turn the gain up pretty high to about 2 o'clock and the bass up to about 2 or 3 as well, and leave that treble set to about 10 o'clock. And we could do this sort of... That is a Weezer song, The World Has Turned and Left Me Here. It has this big, thick, kind of just fuzzy amp sound behind its, prominent acoustic guitar in that song. But that is something that always sticks out to me as a Brit 800 type setting. It really has that low mid-range punch, and turning up the gain and the bass. You can get that really thick. If you were here at the beginning of the stream, I was talking about these power chords where you have the 5th note as the root note or the bass of the chord, the lowest note in the chord. So instead of playing a C power chord like this, you play it like this. and it adds this big thickness to it, and that's what that Weezer song does. And it's connected to that garage rock in a way. It's a similar tone, but it just takes it and pushes it, and that's what a lot of bands in the 90s and 2000s were doing and experimenting with, really pushing an amp in the studio. Now that there were master volume amps, or there were attenuators or pedals that really could push a amp to its max. But we can do that right in the Cambridge 50 itself by adjusting the gain, which is really nice. You heard I had played it first with full guitar volume and then backed down to a cleaner sound. If I back down just the gain from about 2 o'clock to about noon and play that same riff. You get less of that saturation, but it still has gain. And that's something that I really wanted to show, because it's kind of like a lot of people ask when we do streams, or when we do question Instagram stories. A lot of people ask about using pedals with the Cambridge 50, which it does really well, and this will be great for playing with any of your pedals. But it also has some of that push built into it with the gain for each amp model. So if this is your first amp, or this is your amp that you keep at home to just practice, and all your stuff is in the practice space or studio, then it has you covered. It really does a lot for you, and covers this wide range with, it has 11 amp models, but within each amp model, just adjusting the gain can get you, 3, 4, 5 different sounds. And so there's a lot of flexibility here. That's something I wanted to show. And so from there, we have, sticking with the 90s, if I turn the gain down a little bit more and the treble even more, and I'm going to go to my neck pickup even, because this, one example, but there are a lot of bands that use this type of sound, this kind of lo-fi weird indie rock thing of the 90s. This is a Archers of Loaf song that I'm totally doing my best, because I listen to the song over and over to learn, and it's one of my favorite songs, but however they play it is weird, but it's a great song, and it's a great example of showing a setting like this. Something else would be Pavement, or bands like that, Modest Mouse, that have this sort of lower fidelity recording quality, and so it gets this darker crunch tone to it. So this is Web in the Front. So there you go. So to let you know the settings for that, the gain was at about 10 o'clock, the bass was at about 3 o'clock, and the treble was at about 9 o'clock. If I bring that treble back up to noon, here is, that first chord. But there's something about rolling that back to 9 o'clock where you get more of the upper mid-range. So, there's always flexibility to this. You could play that with higher gain. We were on the 800 setting. If I switch this to the 59 and adjust the settings a little bit accordingly, we could do the same thing. So That is sort of that variability of these amp models. Just to show you, we haven't been talking about the VM much because this is more of a high gain thing. But switching over to that, I'll set the gain to about 9 o'clock. We'll do the bass at about noon and the treble at about 10 o'clock. So I was just fooling with the settings there, trying to find something that worked well for that. And it's certainly doable with the VM. But just as a quick example, I think the VM strength is higher gain. So we have this set to gain is like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Bass is also at 1 o'clock. And the treble is at noon. Now, I'm not really a metal player, but, you know, you could get those thrash tones from this. You could get more big metal tones, Iron Maiden kind of thing. We could even go back and play the Black Sabbath riff we did earlier. You know, just a different flavor of gain and with a different character to the mid-range, a little bit less of it and a little bit lower for that amp thickness. So if we shift back to the 800, but I do want to look at some higher gain settings. You may have noticed that the 800 has a little bit of a cut in the low end. That is sort of that tightness that I was talking about with palm muting. If we do a setting like this, which is gain at 1 o'clock, bass at 1 o'clock, treble at noon, we get this big, this crunch that I really associate with punk and early punk or pop punk. I mean, you could certainly do like Green Day. But I really wanted to show a couple different settings or a couple different ways of using this setting, different riffs. The first was a classic punk song from Stiff Little Fingers, Suspect Device. So as you could hear, that is a fast punk song, and whenever I play it, I always rush because I am palm muting so much and kind of getting into that energy of it. But really, those fast palm muting things show off how the tightness of the low end, you have low end here, it's just rolled off in a way that lets you get that punch from palm muting as opposed to this more amp sag, which is really nice for more classic rock kind of vintage settings. But this it really you're not getting anything in the way of that palm muting. So you hear just that, constant chug. You hear that pick attack. So the 800 is like 100% my recommendation if you want to play this more modern punk. And I know that's an early punk song, but like I said, you could do pop punk like Green Day. You could do hardcore with this. There's really a lot of possibility, and this is the amp model that I would certainly use. So another one I wanted to show was Search and Destroy, which is a classic Stooges song. So there you go. That's kind of that to me is like the punk song. That is, when I first heard that, I was like, oh, this is what punk is, and I love it. And it kind of pulled me in, and it really influenced a lot of things from there on. And it has all of those elements. It has this, higher lead thing that really shows off with how this amp model handles those single note riffs, like I was talking about earlier. It has those big chords that we looked at earlier with the Black Sabbath and Weezer songs. And it has palm muting. So that kind of ties together all the things that we've been looking at with the Brit 800 specifically. Of course, there's lots of variation to this outside of what we have looked at already. You could certainly do, a little bit of kind of classic metal with this. You could do a little bit of, more like stadium rock with this big, big sound, or something like, the 2000s post-punk, like the Killers or something like that. There's a lot of variation in the gain range is what I'm trying to say. So if I switch back real quick to show, that riff that encapsulates all the things we've been looking at, this is on the Brit 59 amp model. I'm going to turn the gain up a little bit to about 1 or 2. And turn the bass down to about noon. Treble is about noon. And here's the same riff, just for reference what the difference between these is. So as you could hear, a little more of that palm mute flub, which is a nice sound, and maybe a little bit more accurate to the original recording of this song. But, I like that articulation and really wanted to show that articulation from the Brit 800, and also going up to that lead line. It's a little smoother. It doesn't have as much push and bite as the 800, which again is a nice thing. I love both amp models equally. I'm just showing some of those strengths and differences. And for the sake of showing all three Brit amp models, I'm going to go to the VM. I'm going to put the gain at about 11. And let's just leave bass and treble where they were at noon and show the riff. So that is a bit bigger. It has a lot more going on with how the harmonics of a chord and how it rings out. So if I play that C sharp power chord, there's this big sustain to it, but on the 800 with the gain put back up to about 2 o'clock. It's sustaining, but you'll notice there's a shift in the curve of how that chord is, or the harmonics of how it's ringing out. Different ways of saying the same thing. It just has a different feel to it. And I think both sound great and both work well for this thing specifically. Although, as we looked through, there were strengths and advantages. The VM worked well for that single note Wolfmother riff, where it didn't work as great for the more vintage, Neil Young or Steppenwolf or AC/DC. So, it's just different flavors of the same idea of this classic crunch. So there haven't been any questions this time, which is totally all right. That is what I wanted to show you about the Brit amp models. I'm going to keep an eye on the comments for a bit. Let's go back to the Brit 59 and I'll play a little bit. So I have it set to 59. Amp is about, gain is set to about 2. Let's put bass at about 1 and treble at noon. And I'll just play a little bit. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments of this stream. If not, no problem at all. Look out for future streams. Just a heads up that we have been doing these streams weekly. Next week, we will not be able to do it. So the following week, we will be back on our regular schedule. And that time, we will be looking at, I believe, a little bit of music theory and, chord progressions for guitarists, and kind of talking about some of this stuff I've gone into already, but, how do we use these form a chord progression that sounds like this genre that you want to play, or that genre. And so that one should be fun, something a little bit different. But keep an eye out for the announcement of that stream in case something changes before then. But I'm just going to play for a minute or two, and if there are no questions, then we will wrap up the stream. So thank you, everybody, for watching. All right. Well, I see no questions, which is totally okay. We are going to wrap up the stream. So thank you, everybody, for watching. And I will see you on the next stream, not next week, but the following week. So thank you all.